Okay, friends, here's one more additional video to help you with some science graphing homework. So the graph that you did or are attempting to do has to do with a student who wanted to see whether sleep had an effect on the reaction time of students playing a video game. And so depending on how much sleep they got, the idea would be maybe they won't react as well and they'll crash more in their game. And if you think about the independent and dependent variables here, the dependent variable, which you're collecting, you're not sure about is how many crashes. So on the y-axis, the dependent variable, what you're collecting, in this case would be the number of accidents or crashes. And on the x-axis would be the independent variable, and that would be the amount of hours that each of the students received. So here's the data tables I gave it to you, where we have number of crashes and we have the average hours of sleep. And it certainly appears that when you have less hours of sleep, as in 5 and 6 and 7, you have the higher number of crashes. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that this is indeed the independent variable, the hours of sleep, and this is the dependent variables. And so it's so this would be your information to go on the x-axis, this would be on the y-axis. And so that when you do graph this, hours of sleep here, as we said, and number of crashes, and if I was to start plotting them in, here is our information of 5 hours of sleep, 12 crashes. We have 6 hours of sleep, 10 crashes, and down the line. And you can see the trend is kind of what you expect. So it's actually a negative slope, but what that means is that the shorter the number of hours of sleep, the greater number of crashes. I guess you're sleepy, you don't react as well. So just keep that in mind. So when you go to graph this, I gave you the information to look like this. And I already put in here that this is the dependent variable and this is the independent variable. I did this kind of on purpose because what happens when you have a spreadsheet, whether it be Google spreadsheet or Excel, whatever's in the first column ends up on the x-axis. For example, if I was to say, well, what effect does, or let's rephrase it, so that we're going to see how the number of hours affects, that you've been picking apples, affects the number of apples you're going to get. So at 1 hour, 1.5 hours, and 2 hours, up to 4 hours into the picking time, we're going to kind of keep an eye on how many apples you have. So therefore, in this situation, what you're collecting goes on the y-axis, which is the number of apples, because you don't know what that's going to be, yet you do know that after 1 hour, 1.5 hours, you're going to be collecting something. So that's the independent variable. And if I was to graph this, I'll just do it very quickly, highlight that, and I go insert a chart. I will clearly use a line graph here. We don't want 2 lines, we want 1 line. We're going to have to click this thing. And what we find here is that as you increase, it's pretty constant actually. So at the end of 4 hours, you have close to 300 apples picked. It's kind of pretty much of a straight line going on here. And you notice that the hours here is on the x-axis, which we want. It's 4 hours. It goes from 0 to 4, something like that. And what I want to point out here is, if I cancel this, if I set up the other way where I have the dependent first, and now I graph it, I'll still get an interesting graph. And I'll do the same thing again. I'll insert graph, insert chart, do the line graph, click the little thing so it's only 1 line, and it looks like the same graph, right? But notice that things are changed here. That 0 to 4 is hours, not the number of apples, and it's kind of transposed, and that's because, again, whenever you have a spreadsheet, whatever's in the first column ends up on the x-axis. Whatever on the second column ends up on the y-axis. So if we go back to the data I gave you, this is how it was presented to you. And if I was to make a graph, highlight it, and insert it as is, and again do a line graph, I get a pretty nice line graph, but the only problem is that, remember, the hours of sleep didn't go up to 12. Crashes went up to 12, so it's just opposite of what you want here. Therefore, make sure that before you graph this, that you change it so that on the left column there, we actually have the independent variable, which is the average hours of sleep. So that should be a bit of a hint there to help you along on this.